Thank you very much for coming to this talk. I'm going to do a small presentation to introduce people to the general topic of this book before I have a conversation with Heather, because I think that that will make it easier to understand what the heck we're talking about when we talk about this subject. So give me a second to share my screen with all of you and make it full screen. So my book is called Sting in the Tail: Art, Hoax, and Provocation. It's about a kind of art practice that I call fictive art in this book. So it's an attempt to define the outlines of this practice and then analyze a whole series of examples. So my definition of fictive art has four main pillars. It's a visual artwork in any medium, and this distinguishes it from more purely literary kinds of hoaxes and fakery, such as fake memoirs. There's a strong central narrative, which is fictional, which in fact often turns out to be the generative pole of the project. But the project as a whole, point three, purports to be factual, not fictional. So the entire project is predicated on a central deception aimed at the viewer. And within the project as a whole, the things that are made, the made objects and the texts that are produced tend to serve an evidentiary purpose. That is, they attempt to secure the fiction as fact. They obviously continually fail at this because ultimately there is a fiction at the center, but that is the central attempt of the project. It's sometimes called parafiction or superfiction by other people who have, the few people who've written about this practice. I prefer to stay away from these terms because they give prominence to the idea of fiction and the literary, whereas I think that for this type of practice, the intersection and interaction between the central fiction and the visual materiality of the project is really crucial. And so I don't center the literary in the way I talk about this work. I also see it as lapping over into three very problematic areas of cultural practice: fakes and forgery, because you are, in creating fictive art, you are faking up various elements in order to make it pass as factual. Hoaxes, which again often have, or essentially fundamentally have a deception at their heart, but are rarely, in general, are rarely as sustained a production as fictive art projects are. And then for those projects that have a performative element, which I'll talk about briefly later, imposture is the other area where fictive art sort of speaks to and leans on. These here are some of the kinds of productions that come with fictive art practice. You get speculative and alternative and counter histories. You get alternate worlds that are partially realized. You get imaginary travels. I include micronations in the book. Inexistent artists and movement is a huge part of this practice. Institutional facades of various kinds and media jamming. All of these I cover in different chapters of the book. I'm not going to talk about all of them now because I don't have time, but what I'm going to do instead is show 3 or 4 examples because it's much easier to understand what's going on if we situate it in actual examples. So I'm going to start with 2 artists, Nicholas Kahn and Richard Selesnik, who've done a number of fictive art projects over the years. The Circular River project is one of their projects that inserts a narrative into real history, in this case, the Second World War. And the central narrative here is a story that begins in 1942 with a downed British aviator who crashed in Siberia and an expedition that was sent out to rescue him. And this project is made real by the production of the journals, the expedition journals, which are blow-by-blow accounts of the expedition's travels from Britain to Siberia, and a set of photographs documenting the trip, almost all of them in this extreme panoramic form. And this one in the mummy fields shows the mummy fields of one of the peoples they encounter along the way. So there's, they later turned these into an enormous book. They sometimes give exhibitions of the work, and people come to these photographs and journals and take them to be real, because there's the amount of work that's gone into producing them, conceiving them and producing them, performing them with the people who are in the photographs, creating the objects that are in the photographs, and then creating the photographs themselves. It's almost like a film set, this and several of others of their projects. One of the things they do is employ many of the methods that fakers and forgers use to authenticate these as being from the 1940s. So they age the photographs, they crease them as if they've been stuck in an archive somewhere for many years. They use stamps. You can see an archival stamp here and another kind of set of marks here. And of course, sepia toning, black and white photographs, costuming, all of this tends to create a strong impression in the viewer's mind of work from the period we're looking at, preserved historical documents. And this use of authenticating devices is common throughout fictive art, because otherwise there's no way to secure the project to the supposed period in which it belongs. This is a detail of one of the photographs here. They eventually found the down flyer dead in a lake. And many of the photographs draw on references from throughout art history. There's one photograph that draws on medieval dance of death imagery. This one, in my opinion, draws on sort of the Western art viewers' knowledge of the Monet water lilies, which are sort of in the background of many of our minds if we've ever been to museums. And that creates both a sense of familiarity in the work. Oh yes, we've seen this kind of thing before, and also serves to perhaps for some people create small clues as to maybe this isn't quite real. There's a number of clues in this project to it being not quite real. One of them is the extremely elaborate objects that we've never seen anywhere else before. Could we really have known so little about shamanistic cultures of Siberia? It's an open question. So the raising of doubt in the viewer's mind is something that fictive artists generally are trying to do more or less overtly and in various ways. Here's another project, another fictive artist with a different set of projects. Beauvais Lyons has worked in a number of different areas of fictive art, and one of them is fictive archaeology, which is was a very big part of a number of his projects over the years. So many fictive art projects situate themselves either as counter history or something scientific, because those are two fields in which you can assert truth, you can make truth claims and assert factuality as against genres which are purely fictional and understood as such. He works for a number of these projects under the umbrella title of the Hoax Archives, and created a couple of Near Eastern civilizations, the Apasht and the Azudians. He works in a number of media that mutually support each other, but one of the media, as you see here, is ceramics, actual ceramics. He creates the shards of the civilization as if they had been dug up by archaeologists on a dig. This here is a set of temple fragments. Here he is, among other things, making use of the technique of incompleteness that's favored by many fictive artists. That is, they choose media or narratives that allow the viewer to accept a story with many holes in it that is incomplete for reasons other than the fact that the artist simply couldn't get around to finishing it. So obviously, an archaeological excavation is perfect for this, since we never recover anything whole from such digs. The forced disappearance of wartime in the previous project gives another possibility. There are many, many holes that appear in wartime histories. The selective nature of photo albums has also been put to good use by fictive artists in order to avoid having to let the viewer know everything or have a complete story. Here's another one of the ceramic fragments. You'll notice he's also created a set of hieroglyphs, and a symbolic kind of language that is familiar sort of from, if we've been to museums of Egyptian and Sumerian art. And he's added to the authenticity of these pieces by not filling them in, or by, in the case of the print on the right, sort of filling in speculatively, but making it clear that there's fragments and then there's speculation. So even within the project, there's a deceptive differencing between speculation or fabulation and fact. So the fact of the project itself. Lyons is equally gifted as a printmaker as he is as a maker of objects, and he uses the language of printmaking very strongly in these projects, in several of his different projects. And here's an example of how he likes to set his lithographs, his prints, in a visual language and style as if they had come out of 19th century scientific publications. Again, the toning, the formal qualities of the organization, the typefaces, all of this says, oh yes, scientific knowledge, but 100 years back. So there's ways in which he's reproducing scientific knowledge as also a periodizing, if that's the word I want, technique. And that by conforming to standard display practices, by displaying work in archaeological or natural historical museums instead of art museums, all of these embraces of authenticating devices that we rely on when we are going out and looking at things in the world are being deployed very consciously and strategically in these projects to lull the viewer into accepting them as real. The really major self-outing element in this project is, in fact, the name of the project itself, the Hoax Archives. When you look at it in print, as you might on a wall didactic, you might not think much about it, but when you hear the word in your head, hoax, and realize it's a homonym for hoax, H-O-A-X, you've been given a giant clue to maybe not take this project at face value. He's also worked in another area that a number of fictive artists have embraced, which is the area of cryptofauna, missing or extinct species. Here you have a print of one of collections of ancient, very ancient animals, which he calls the Mesosorbidae species. And you can see they're not incredibly credible. They very much have a portmanteau quality. He has others that are much more immediately credible. And he's made a number of these under the umbrella of a fictive organization. And fictive organizations are something else that artists like to work with. They like to give themselves an institutional facade to gain further authenticity, further expertise and credibility. And he has a project, an association called the Association for Creative Zoology. And he goes out, and as you can see here, he sells the prints to the public, and he gives talks in character as one of the people who founded, not himself, but somebody who founded the Association for Creative Zoology or works with it. And he uses these public moments outside of the art world to try to have productive conversations with people about creationism and intelligent design in a more sort of disarming and quiet way. He also gave lectures as an archaeological expert within the archaeological project as well. And this is another common theme throughout fictive art projects, the adoption of a secondary persona that is an expert of some kind, a curator very commonly, and in this case, the founder of an association. The Catalan artist Jon Fontcuberta, best known as a photographer, has also made some extinct animals. And in this case, he's created what he refers to as an aquatic hominid, which you might also think of as a mermaid, which he calls the Hydropithecus. That one's from 2006. And now I'm going to turn to a different kind of project. I mentioned imposture earlier. Impostures are often short-term in the world, and they're done for specific kinds of gain or status. The artists who I'm interested in are adopting persona and then living them out in depth. And Lynn Hirschman Leeson is one of the artists who done this. Back in the 1970s, she created an entire alter ego for herself with a complete and separate life. Roberta Brightmore was her alter ego, and Roberta had her own apartment, her own handwriting, her own clothing, her own social circle, her own life story, her own friends. And here you have a photograph of her meeting somebody out in the world. What she's doing here is an extreme version of what is sometimes called heteronymity, to distinguish it from pseudonymity. A pseudonym we think of as a pen name. It's a facade we used, like we might put it on a book so that we can have a little bit of an arm's length from something. A heteronym is when the character, the alternate character, has gone beyond a name and has a biography, has a story, often has a voice of their own, a way of being in the world that is distinctly separate from one's regular persona, if there is such a thing. One of the best known examples of an artist dedicated to heteronymity is the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who created over 70 different identities, some of which he admittedly used much more than others. And each of them had their own story and their own artistic method. So heteronymity and imposture, if you go kind of deep into this, allows artists to explore facets of their own minds and creativity that they might not be able to surface otherwise. And these kinds of projects raise a question of having to do with at what point a life stops being imposture or performance and becomes a real life, right? The sociologist Irving Goffman many years ago wrote a book in which he talks about how the degree to which we're all performing in our everyday lives. And this is something that has perhaps we've all become more acutely aware of in the era of Instagram and socially curated, perfected images of our perfect lives. So perhaps one of the things fictive artists are trying to get at is that the solution, or not the solution, but one way forward is to multiply our lives rather than to try to find one individuated personality and way of being that satisfies all our needs as artists. I don't have time. I would actually like to skip this project. You can read my book. Suzanne Trester has done some very interesting projects. This is her Time Travelers project, for which she created costumes and time traveling equipment. This is her alter ego Hillel Fisher Tromberg, who was a Wall Street financier who turned into an artist and created this extraordinary set of works around using high frequency trading algorithms, gematria, and psychoactive chemistry as part of the practice. But I want to skip so that I can actually start talking about this with Heather in more expansive way. So I'm going to stop with Iris Heisler, a German-born Canadian artist, and two of her projects. He named her Amber, is the first one that I want to talk about. And this one is centered on the story of a 19th century Irish maid named Mary O'Shea, who was also a secretive self-taught artist making strange objects in wax that she hid. She worked in a building called the Grange, which is now a Canadian art gallery. And it was in the Grange that Heisler produced this project in 2008. She went into the building and actually literally created a set of excavations, breaking through walls and floors to find the objects that Mary O'Shea had theoretically secreted there 100 years before in the 19th century. So visitors to the exhibition were toured through the building as if it were a real live in-process excavation with the curators talking to them and the docents talking to them about what was being done and what they'd found and what it meant, and keeping the docent information entirely as if this was real history and something that had really happened. It was only at the very, very end that visitors were alerted to the fact that the entire thing was a fabrication. Here, for example, is one of the excavations in progress. I need to take a very brief break. My to shut out my dog, who I'm afraid is about to start barking. I will be back in 30 seconds. This is Zoom, right? Babies and dogs.
And while Antoinette steps out, you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A. We already have a few.
So this is a Mary O'Shea excavation underway. You can see that they've actually knocked through a wall and created something that looks exactly like you would expect an excavation to look. Heisler's primary intention, like that of most fictive artists, is not just to trick the audience. It's not about one-upsmanship. She wanted to provide a direct experience of art and a participatory sense of discovery in the visitors, which she then undercut at the very end and allowed them to then reflect on the project in a wholly different way. And she felt that by doing it this way, she heightened visitors' empathy for her fictional immigrant, 19th century immigrant. And as is often the case with these projects, when visitors discovered they had been tricked, many of them were angry and felt disrespected. But others acknowledged that the project had prompted them to reflect on what counts as history and how you talk about and make history. And they were impressed by and sort of, not impressed is the wrong word, but taken with the kind of enormous skill and care with which this piece had been created for them, in effect. Another of her projects, the last one I'm going to talk about, is another invented artist, this one from the early 20th century rather than 19th century, Sophie La Roche, a French artist. And Heisler trained as a sculptor, and in order to make this project, she retaught herself as a painter and created several hundred paintings and drawings, some of which you can see here in Sophie La Roche's notebooks, as well as various small cast sculptures and memorabilia. She even had art experts examine some of the works with X-rays and other techniques to kind of create a conservatorship authentication angle to the project. I find Heisler really outstanding for the care and attention she pays to all aspects of these projects, from researching the details of the historical setting, fabricating the artworks themselves and the associated evidence, pulling it together into a coherent storyline, and involving real-world personnel from docents to conservators in the project as part of this ever-expanding narrative that she sets up the initial conditions, she sets up some objects, and then it sort of slowly expands in the world. So it's in appreciation of her work, her dedication, that I actually used this image on the cover of the book. I felt like it really represented the best of this kind of work. So it can seem as if the main point of fictive art lies in the deception, the trick, the lie at the heart of it. I feel that this is to miss the point. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book was to try to interrogate why I didn't feel that was the case, why I felt it was too easy to dismiss these projects as just hoaxes, which is very often what happens when they first appear in the world or are first outed. And so here's one thing I wrote toward the end of the book. We're cast into the discomforting terrain of not knowing. One of the fascinations of this work is its extravagance, the sheer amount of labor that goes into creating and sustaining these fictions. In its expansive deceptions, fictive art produces complicated forms of doubt and pleasure, and doubt is one of our chief shields against authoritarianism, or that narrowing of thought that leads to doctrinaire thinking. Fictive art asks us to believe only to deliberately undercut that belief. It teaches us how to productively and pleasurably engage in uncertainty. And with that, I would like to turn to my conversation with Heather, whose wonderful book on Canadian fictive art and related forms of making I highly recommend.
Thank you so much, Antoinette, and to everyone joining us. Yeah, I'm here in the dark in Mi'kma'ki, so I just want to acknowledge the territory that I'm on. I'm coming from Halifax, Nova Scotia. So I first just want to acknowledge too how enormous this project is. As someone who studies this, Antoinette's book outlines and collects a huge array of art that I think many others have thought of as disparate or one-offs or disconnected. And this book sort of collects it as a piece of art history. These are not one-offs. This is a trajectory of art making that has happened for some time. So I'm really excited to talk about that trajectory a little bit. And I was wondering if you would start maybe just speaking a little bit about the language. You mentioned sort of parafiction and superfiction, and you've chosen the term fictive art and hoaxes. And what are some of the usefulnesses of these classifications? And then what are some of the limitations that happen when we use hoax or something like that to define them?
So the first term is actually superfiction, which comes from Peter Hill, who wrote really the first he wrote a PhD thesis about this kind of practice. He is himself a fictive art maker, and parafiction has come in and is used by other writers like Carrie Lambert Beatty, who has written a very important article on the subject. As I said, I find that they privilege fiction, and there's lots of ways in which fakeness and fiction have been bedfellows for a long time, and there's all kinds of tensions around that, as I mentioned, over fake memoirs, for example. I wanted a term, when I was first thinking about this actively, and in 2002, I organized a College Art Association panel on the subject with Lisa Patt. We spent a lot of time talking about what we should call this, and because we wanted a term that somehow got to the heart of it. And we chewed up all kinds of different things, and we settled on it because it has both the fiction and the art, and people don't think of art as having fiction in it. And so we felt like it brought the fictionality in, but foregrounded art making. It's not a perfect term because it doesn't really bring in the idea of the deception that's at the heart of it. We couldn't find a term that was perfect. And this is a problem with language, that no term is ever sufficient in itself. I wondered, though, if you had some similar issues when you were writing your book, feeling like the language wasn't adequate. The problem with hoax, of course, is pejorative. Nearly all of the terms in this area are pejorative. So that was the other reason we felt we needed a new term, is that we wanted to get something that started out being not instantly associated with badness.
Yeah. No, I discovered the same dilemma, and automatically most sort of critics think of it as a type of forgery, which is very different. A forgery is deliberately deceiving someone for the sake often of financial privilege or benefit. And these art forms probably actually cost the artists more money than they are ever going to see from it. Many of these pieces of art are never for sale, which is also interesting. They're an immersive experience, but one that you can't purchase. So a lot of the terminology I came across, people even writing in it debated with themselves about what to call it, I found.
That's a great point. Every time you read an article about one of these projects, the writer usually spends the first 3 paragraphs trying to decide what it is they're looking at and what they should be calling it. And I think your point about forgery is important, in that forgeries need to stay under the surface in order to succeed. As soon as they're outed, they become something else. Whereas these projects, I feel the conversation about them only gets interesting when they're in the process of being discovered or have been discovered, and there's a conversation about what the artist is actually trying to do.
Yeah, the reveal it's not almost a full work until that reveal occurs. To the
I really
viewer
think so.
Yeah. I had a question through the chat that I think is relevant too. What do you think is the importance of creating believability? And conversely, what is the significance of pointing to the falseness of the project? And I think you mentioned that a little bit in your last slide of text, but what is the importance of that believability to this form of art? And then why is falseness important to the project too? I think it's a really lovely question about the kind of dichotomy that the work includes.
When a project is credible as something, as history, as science, we take a set of heuristics, mental heuristics with us to how we look at it. We think about it a certain way. We try to understand it through our pre-existing knowledge and fit it into a story we already know. And so we bring a different set of presumptions about knowledge than we do if we come to something knowing, oh, that's an Abex painting. And that's, so I can fit it into art and I don't have to worry about these other things. And so when you're bringing believability, you're asking for people to exercise their credibility and also to think about it in terms of how it fits into their knowledge of the world. And then you start to undo that. So then you are asking the viewer to reflect on why they think they know what they do. It's essentially a project that's very closely tied into kind of our sense of epistemology in our lives, why we want to know things, why we reject certain kinds of things as knowledge, and what it is when we come out of an art project, what it is that we know about the world, even if the thing is in some sense false, which I think is similar to the conversation people have about fake memoirs, which are often extremely revealing, even despite and because of their fakeness.
Right. Even it tells us something about the author, perhaps, or the artist, perhaps, needing to fake something
Right.
for something to be included, right? So many of your examples point to voices in art history that would otherwise, have disappeared or be invisible or not seen or not included in, a fairly patriarchal and white discourse of art for a long, long period of time. Like many of the pieces you include
Right.
have female artists' voices, and I'd love to hear more of why you think that's true, like that the fake has to be included at all, or the fictive artwork.
One of the people I think of when you bring that up is Vera Frankel, the Canadian artist who created an alter ego, who had lived in an earlier period and created videos about her life and all kinds of sort of the apparatus of somebody who was not included in art history. So it was her way of talking about exclusions. And so one of the things that can come up is this idea of there are people who are excluded from knowledge making. They're not part of the canon. They're not asked to be contributing to the canon. And so there's a question about what kind of a stake you should have in certain forms of knowledge production from which you are yourself excluded in one way or another. And at the same time, there's a way in which going certain forms that we believe we're familiar with, particularly fiction and art. Those are frames like the proscenium frame of the theater that tell us this is a sacred space, certain things are happening here, and we don't have to accept that they have a specific kind of bearing on the rest of the world, the rest of our lives. And so there's a way in which art is a safe space, and that's an important thing for it to be. Mm-hmm. And yet, one of the things artists like Frankel are doing is creating a non-safe space because they don't, no safe space perhaps really feels safe to them. So to play with this idea of a counter history, feminists are already trying to write a counter history. People of color are already trying to write counter histories. And so these speculative historical projects form yet another form of counter history to illuminate places where the knowledge making has been problematic in one way or another.
Yeah. I mean, so I had the great pleasure of walking through He Named Her Amber and believing completely that it was an excavation. And at that point, the reveal happened, that exhibit was up for quite a while. So the reveal changed in some ways through the practice of that. But I received a letter and read it and was astonished. And immediately my response was delight. I was just thrilled that I had been completely taken in and mistaken. And I immediately wanted to walk through again to see it again. But as you said, some people get quite angry, right? People revoked their gallery memberships. They wrote letters just expressing their, just why are you forcing us into a position of distrust? I feel embarrassed. I feel like I've been lied to. So is there an ethical edge, though, even though we like the potential is to include more stories in our histories to allow us to think about the institutions that we put our trust in, like, is there an ethical edge? Do you see a problem with this form of art with audiences ever? Or have you thought of it being taken too far in any instance?
Before I address that, can I ask you why do you think you weren't outraged?
I I mean, partly I write fiction, so it felt as though the dream that you have as a child when you love storybooks of actually walking into one
Mhm.
had just happened to me as an adult. Like, I'm getting goosebumps talking about it. It did truly change my life, to be honest. It was just the most remarkable experience, and to think that one person had put, as you said, just so much effort and time and thought and trust in volunteer docents to walk me through this and play with our answers and improvise with us so that we became part of the storybook
Right.
ourselves. I just felt in awe that someone would have done that and I got to participate. And I didn't feel angry, but partly I think it's because I like being mistaken. I don't,
Ah,
yeah, I don't think a lot of people maybe feel comfortable with it. We work really hard to not be. Um, but it made it feel, as you said, safe because it was a piece of art. It's sort of that catharsis that can come from theater, or you see a movie and go through those emotional roller coasters and are sort of relieved of them after you step out of the theater a little bit. But yeah, I sort of like the feeling of being mistaken. It makes me know I'm learning something
mhm,
and alive in a different way. But I also relate to the fact that it's non-consensual often in these forms of art. When you
mhm.
step into them, you're not told what it is completely you are experiencing. And I think that can be very disarming. Um, yeah.
I agree. I grew up in a family that was very fond of hoaxes and pranks and was the butt of some of them in my childhood and was always embarrassed and infuriated, partly because I felt targeted in a very specific way. In general, though, I think that the best of these projects, you don't feel targeted in the same way. And that this is perhaps one of the difference between pranks and practical jokes and this kind of an artwork. It's the there's an impersonality to it that I think is helpful. And I think one of the things Heisler does is by walking you through as a participant, you end up at the end feeling like an extra in the
Mhm.
stage set, perhaps. I'm just guessing because I've never saw that installation myself. So you almost feel like you're a little tiny piece of it and not someone who was being humiliated. But I think that is a risk with these projects, and I think that's one of the reasons that the self-outing elements tend to be so important for a lot of these projects. Now, Heisler uses fewer of them than a lot of artists, and hers are often more subtle.
Mhm.
Like there's a reference to a Duchamp piece and somewhere in that installation, all kinds of things. But there are other artists, for example, who use very obvious silly names or names like the Hoax archives that are just big giant clues. Another one that many people in this audience may be familiar with who are from Los Angeles is the Museum of Jurassic Technology, uh, which is a really wonderful place which has in it objects that range and exhibits that range from fully fictional to fully true and everything in between. And it's very hard actually to tell what's what in there. But the name itself, when the first time somebody told me about it, I knew that something was wrong with this museum because dinosaurs technology, there was just something I knew was going to ask me to think about what was going on. So yes, there is an ethical question, and I think that the artists need to um, be prepared for the fact that the initial deception may never be acceptable to some people,
Yeah.
and and there are ways to mitigate it, and I think those methods are important.
Yeah. The feeling of inclusion, I think, is a really important part, that you've come to be a creator in the story somehow as a participant.
And in fact, a number of artists, and I believe Heisler's one, actually take, when the audience writes to them on their website, or when somebody makes a suggestion, they may accept those suggestions and roll them into the project, or respond to them in some ways. So there is an intention to be inclusive in some of these projects.
Yeah, it is very much like a choreography with the suggestions and speculations of the audience often, which is interesting. Yeah. There's a few other questions. So you mentioned the Museum of Jurassic Technology, and I feel like this question from Carlos is interesting, that may also connect to an earlier question. Because they're about particular types of objects that one might find. So would found footage films be considered fictive art, since they present as reality even though they are fiction? And you mentioned some YouTube videos that are perhaps brush up against that in your book. And Carlos asks, can cryptofauna, which I've never heard that term and I love it, still be used for art today? So a couple of object suggestions here in these questions. Like, are there limits to the objects that can be included, I suppose? Or what do you make of the sort of like forms, I suppose?
So the boundaries are really fuzzy, and I drew them one way, Heather drew them another, somebody else will draw them in a certain way. It's very hard at the margins to figure out what should be in and what should be out. And even where I drew boundaries, I had to leave a bunch of things out. It's just the nature of the book. I think that I spent a lot of time debating whether I should have a section on documentaries, mockumentaries. Like, there's a million terms now for fake, semi-fake, and fake filmmaking. Which so many terms now that it's almost like each nuance of the fact fiction spectrum has its own name now. Yeah. So I think you could easily collect at least some of those in the field. But I actually think it might be worth doing a whole book on that particular subject, because it is such a large field with so many different variations on it, in terms of whether something has been staged, whether something is completely fake, whether, as you say, found footage is being used and put to another purpose. There's just an astonishing range of variations in the filmic world. I think you had a second part to the question, but
someone was asking if cryptofauna could be considered fictive art, and I've never heard that term, but the Museum of Jurassic Technology, I think, has some examples, at least that I've seen, that would count as cryptofauna.
I think cryptozoology is generally thought of as the field that includes only really imaginary things like the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot, but it also includes, crypto means hidden. It includes things that simply have not been discovered yet. And there aren't very many of those, at least in the large mammal kingdom, because they're big enough that they've been mostly found, but there's an awful lot of hidden insects, for example. So the idea that there are things we haven't discovered yet, perhaps in extinct fauna, it seems to me that you absolutely could keep using cryptozoology as a field of practice. And there's 3 or 4 projects that I touch on in the book.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Okay, there's the question that is always asked of scholars of hoaxes that I'm going to ask you, but I'm also going to add maybe a little addition to the question. So Alice is asking, this is very thought-provoking, thank you, but why should we believe anything you're telling us? How do we know your book is not itself fictive art? And then the question I'm going to append to Alice's, if she doesn't mind, or they don't mind, is you're not only a theorist of this, Antoinette, you're a practitioner. You yourself have made what I would call certainly fictive art. So maybe you could speak to both, like the believability of being a theorist, but how that sometimes needs to stretch into practice sometimes. I don't know.
Well, I have to say, I've gotten this question so many times, and it's true. There's no reason you should
No.
necessarily believe me, especially if you haven't read the book. I could be making most of this up. And the only way to determine it is the same way you would determine anything else. You would actually have to read the book and look at how carefully I have tracked stuff down and footnoted things. And I have to tell you, it was an incredibly difficult book to write for that reason, because for each project, there was the story and then the reality, and then about 3,000 versions of that the artist told at different times. And trying to sort all of this out was really difficult. And I'm absolutely certain I failed at a number of points. But I was interested. I did spend a lot of time in the book trying to be as accurate as I could possibly be, so that in order to have the kind of work understood as a genre. And I tried not to include anyone in the book that I thought would feel outed by the book, because there are a number of projects that have never been outed. And I had to, in a couple of cases, I actually had conversations with the artists about whether they wanted to be included in the book, because I wasn't prepared to out anybody against their will. So yeah, that's a problem. You'd have to look and see whether you felt that my scholarship added up, or if it was, full of contradictions and holes. As she says, I have done a number of these projects myself, in most of them, some of them by myself and some in collaboration with other people. And I find that for myself, it's a very freeing form of creativity I tend to work with heteronyms, or kind of personae, or things that I set up at arm's length, and then I can construct this entire story around. And I have to say, at a very simple level, I enjoy making use of the tools of fakery, which is something that many artists have as part of their skill set. It's just that something they develop along the way as they make art. So it's quite entertaining to put it to use in service of a creative project.
You spoke about collaboration, and this book is dedicated to your own friend and collaborator, Lisa Pat, who worked with you at the Institute of Cultural Inquiry and was a co-collaborator on one of these fictive art pieces, the Manual of Lost Ideas. So I'm wondering if you could chat a little bit about the role of collaboration and friendship in these pieces. Often it involves collaborators because they're such massive projects. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
I cannot tell you how much I wish Lisa could have been here. She died in 2019, just before the pandemic started, but she was in on the ground floor of thinking about this as an art practice and talking. I talked through the ideas on this so much with her, and she read a draft of the book and had lots of really useful comments. It's really a shame she didn't get to see the book finished. But she founded the Institute of Cultural Inquiry and initiated a number of projects. The Manual of Lost Ideas was one of those projects that started with just an idea about what are we going to do with these ideas we never can do anything with. Lost ideas. Artists have millions of lost ideas, or failed ideas, or backburnered ideas. And what happened is what I have often seen happen in these projects, by reading about how other artists make their projects. A storyline kind of emerged, and then in order to make the story seem real, things had to be produced. So the story generated the objects, and I find that generative engine of fiction. We create the art out of the engine of fiction is one of the things that is very consistent across many of these projects, and it revealed aspects of the people that I had never seen before. One of the main collaborators on the Manual of Lost Ideas came up with this enormously elaborate coding scheme for the Manual of Lost Ideas that then everybody else had to cope with and carry on and figure out how to deal with. So it's sort of like an improvisational ball that's constantly being handed back and forth. Like, here, now it turns out that half of this thing was burned. Now you have to deal with the fact that half of this thing was burned. What are you going to do about that? So there's this wonderful challenge in the project when you have more than one person involved that is that is really captivating in my own experience.
Thank you. I hope I'm doing a fairly adequate job of interfacing your wonderful questions into our conversation. We only have a few moments left, so if you still would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A and I'll try to tuck it in. I have a question here that's quite lovely as well about, in addition to your own book, are there other forms or works of critical theory in particular that you think would be helpful either for fictive artists to read, or another question is like, is there critical theory that helps, that has been maybe an influence or sign pointer when you were conceiving of the book? Or you mentioned Barthes, you mentioned Walter Benjamin, maybe influences to the artists, perhaps, I don't know. But how does critical theory or some writers in that genre perhaps connect to the form of fictive art? How do you see that?
Well, I touch on a lot of the theorists in the book at various points, Baudrillard and the problem of simulation. But one of the people I found most useful to my own thinking is the philosopher Nelson Goodman, who has a book called Ways of World Making, because these projects are essentially world making projects. They have to build up into something that's coherent. It may not be a whole world, it may just be a slice of a world, a slice of history, a slice of science. But he has a number of ideas in there about how worlds are always built out of other worlds, and that they involve processes of selection and assemblage and editing. And it's a very small book. It was written years and years ago, but it seems to speak to something about the way these projects come into being that I think is really essential. There are other people that I've leaned on as well.
I have a genre question in particular too about fictive history or fictive art connecting to science fiction. Is there a way that all of these sort of imaginative futurisms then are potentially created?
It's a form of speculative fiction, instantiated through art and objects. And so in that way, it has this close connection with other forms of speculative fiction like science fiction. But this idea of trying to reify the fiction, like, here, look at these things prove it's real. Science fiction can't do that. Science fiction can merely say, and maybe merely is the wrong word, it can say, it's going to be like this a few years in the future. So it's kind of a proleptic field, whereas fictive art is very much about, in the present, here's the stuff, I'm going to put it in your face and make you believe that this really happened, really is true.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to end on, Antoinette? You mentioned there's an Easter egg in your book.
Oh, yes.
And also that you are doing a wonderful online tour of talks with some of the artists from November to March. So maybe we can end with those just things to think about in the future.
Right. So this goes back to me being obviously an unreliable narrator, because why should you believe me? But in point of fact, because of this idea, the idea that deception lies in this field, I have planted an Easter egg in the book, which I encourage people to try to find. It's not a very difficult one, since I'm not a puzzle maker by trade, but I had a great deal of fun making it, and I hope somebody unearths it fairly quickly. And then I'm in the process of arranging a series of more or less monthly talks with some of the artists in the book. I want to turn the focus to the artists themselves and their wonderful works and practices. So starting in November and going through to March, I'm going to basically be interviewing one artist a month. We'll be videoing those, recording those and putting them on YouTube as a series that will live on after the fact. So if you're interested in this and want to just know more about what the artists themselves are doing, I want to encourage people to keep an eye out for that series when it comes along. We're calling it Art, Hoax, and Provocation, talking about fictive art. So thank you, everybody, so much.
Wow, that was just a wonderful conversation. I loved seeing the images, learning about the projects, and also hearing both of you talk with such insight and humor and compassion about this wonderful work. Thank you also to our audience. Please check out Illumination's website for more events, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.